Are you a real estate investor looking to elevate your income, freedom, and lifestyle? If so, optimize your daily performance by downloading our free guide, Raising the Bar, 5 Steps to Elevate Your Habits at elevatepod.com. In this guide, created by yours truly, you'll learn why you do what you do, how to easily institute cues in your environment to trigger desired behavior, directly applicable steps to create a fulfilling future, and much more. Get your free copy now at elevatepod.com and kickstart your new habits today. Your future self will thank you.
Welcome to Elevate, the masterclass where we dissect the elements of exceptional achievement and lifestyle design with a focus on personal growth and real estate investing. Now, here's your host, Tyler Chesser.
Elevate Nation, welcome back. This is Tyler Chesser. I'm so thankful to have you here, and I'm blessed and grateful to be sitting with Dr Weiss today. You're going to learn the myths of negotiation, and you're going to learn about taking your negotiation to the next level. Ultimately, when it comes down to creating outcomes in real estate, we've got to understand the best practices of negotiation. We've got to understand that our emotions are at play, and we can't get rid of those things. We also have to understand that ultimately it's not us versus someone else, right? And that's just a little hint, because you're going to learn so much today. This episode is extremely valuable, maybe the most valuable discussion I've ever had on negotiation. And I'm giving that to you right today. I'm so excited about this. Elevate Podcast is all about mindset, mind expansion, and personal development for high-performing real estate investors. Guess what? All of those things are critical to taking your negotiation success to the next level. I'm so excited to give you this today. I'm your host, Tyler Chesser, and I'm a professional real estate investor and high performance coach. It is my job to decode the stories, habits, and multifaceted expertise of world-class investors and other experts to help you elevate your performance and lifestyle. Are you ready to take it to another level? It is time. We are going to raise the bar today. So let's do that. Before we dive into this podcast, this episode, welcome to Elevate. If this is your first time, we're so thankful and excited to have you here. If you've been here before, welcome back. I want to encourage you to pay the fee. If you've been here before, you know what that fee is. It's just to pay it forward. All you have to do is share this episode with one person. I'll let you know that there's several easy ways to do that. All you have to do is just grab the link, send in a text message, an email, post it on social media, and tell this person why it is that they would benefit from listening to this episode. If you've already paid it forward in the past, we just ask that you do that again. The only way that we can continue to grow is if we receive the value of your introductions. Just like any other business, it's about referrals, and the best compliment you can give us, the best thank you that you can give us here at Elevate Podcast is to share and to pay it forward. I think you're going to give tons of value. You're going to receive tons of value from listening to this podcast today. So I want to invite you to go ahead and do that. And also, I want to ask you, please, to give us a rating, review, and subscribe or follow Elevate Podcast so that you're notified of the next episode that comes out, because we are bringing the heat. Today's episode is incredibly valuable. It could be endlessly valuable, not only from a cash perspective, a net worth perspective, a passive income perspective, but also in the way that you design relationships, the way that you design your partnerships. I mean, oh my gosh, I love this episode. I'm so excited about it. I want to dive in. I want to introduce you to Dr Weiss, who is the co-founder with William Ury of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard University and a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project. He is also the director and creator of the Master of Science degree in Leadership and Negotiation at Bay Path University. He received his Ph.D. from the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University in 2002. Dr. Weiss has spoken and published on leadership, negotiation, mediation, and systemic approaches to dealing with conflict. In his current capacity, he conducts research, consults with many different types of organizations, delivers negotiation and mediation trainings and courses, and engages in negotiation and mediation at the organizational, corporate, government, and international levels. His newest book, to be published by Wiley Press, was available actually in August 2020, and is entitled The Book of Real World Negotiations: Successful Strategies from Business, Government, and Daily Life. The book shines a light on real world negotiation examples and cases rather than discussing hypothetical scenarios. It reveals what is possible through preparation, persistence, creativity, and taking a strategic approach to your negotiations. And I could go on and on. I mean, he's he's an author of children's books that really help children learn negotiation and conflict resolution skills. He's an innovative creator of a number of products that use the power of technology to convey negotiation and conflict resolution knowledge and skills to a broad audience. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. You talk about a prolific speaker who's, spoke on the TED Talk stage in 2018. He gave a talk called The Wired Negotiator, which he speaks about in this podcast episode about the role of technology in negotiation, how to use it most effectively. Today's episode is action-packed. It's applicable. It's practical, and it's extremely valuable. So get your notepad out. Get ready to take notes. You're going to find distinctions today. You're going to make a leap. You're going to elevate your game today. And I'm excited for you. So without further ado, please enjoy this amazing conversation with Josh Weiss. Josh Weiss, welcome to Elevate. How are you?
I'm great, Tyler. Thanks so much for having me.
I tell you what, it was very, very exciting to have just a brief few moments with you before the podcast today, because I was telling you, I literally got off the phone. I'm in this heel digging negotiation. It's this, very what I would suggest to be unsophisticated approach, high, low. It's in what you illuminated to me prior to our conversation to be more bargaining than actually negotiation. But obviously your life's work has been to uncover sort of not only the myths of negotiation, but how to meet those objectives and how to utilize this skill and these techniques to get what you want in life and to preserve your reputation and so forth. So I'm excited about this conversation, Josh. Before we dive in, if you were to describe yourself in the way that people that know you best would describe you, what would they say about you?
I think that they would say that, that I'm very passionate about what I do, that I care deeply about effective negotiation, dealing with conflict, helping people live kind of better lives. And so that's in many ways that sort of feels like my cause in life, is to help people to understand that there are ways of handling their problems, their challenges. We live in a society of conflict avoiders because everybody picks up a phone and calls a lawyer when there's a problem. Mm-hmm. And I firmly believe that people can learn how to, handle their conflicts, how to negotiate effectively with a little thinking, et cetera. And I would hope people, I think, would say that I tried to live what I teach. I don't really think that you can do this without trying. I don't always succeed. I have 3 daughters. They would tell you that, and my wife would tell you that as well. But I try, and I think that if there's a field where it would be very disingenuous for me to say, you've got to do things in X, Y, and Z way, and then I'm doing them in PDQ, this would be it. And so I hope that's what people would share, that I did my best to not only teach people some important skills, but also tried to live this as best as possible.
Yeah. And it really resonates with me. You talk about the level of conflict avoiders that are in society today. And I think our lower self wants us to avoid conflict because it's uncomfortable. It's challenging. It doesn't feel good. But my business partner, he says this all the time. He's like, your success is directly correlated to the level of challenging conversations you're willing to have. And I think that this comes down to negotiation at the end of the day. And so obviously we're speaking to real estate investors today at the heart of, creating agreement or achieving objectives, which you just educated me on very well before this conversation. At the heart of that is it's negotiation. So I'd love to start with the myths of negotiation to kind of lay the foundation. And then I want to go into some strategies, some tips, some tactics, and so forth. But let's start with the myths of negotiation.
So can I add one little note about conflict?
Please, absolutely.
And then I'll go into the myths, promise. So to me, and I know this is going to sound strange to folks listening, but conflict isn't necessarily a bad thing. Conflict actually brings things to the surface that need attention. Something's not working, right? And so a conflict arises because people are disagreeing, they have a different view on a problem, et cetera. And in some ways, I actually feel like it's sort of a natural part of the decision-making process. You and I talked a little bit about the notion of mindset. And for me, when a conflict arises, I say, okay, this means that there's a problem that I was unaware of that now is on the surface, and now I have to deal with it. Mm-hmm. So I think if people can change their mindset when it comes to conflict and say, okay, so let's get into problem solving mode. We've got a problem. Let's fix it, right? It changes your whole orientation toward things. And life is rife with conflict. I mean, there's just no way, because everybody brings their own perspective to the table, right? And so we see the world differently. And as a result, we're going to have these kinds of scenarios that happen. So I guess I would just say to your listeners, give it a try to say, okay, so there's a conflict that's come up. We have a disagreement. We have a problem. Like, let's roll up our sleeves and deal with it. Because what I've found is that if you know how to handle conflict, if you have the skills of dealing with it, then in the end, you can actually solve it, and it strengthens the relationship. It's when you don't know how to handle it that people pull back, as you were saying, into their instinctual kind of ways of handling things, and they either fight or flee or, et cetera. And the other thing I'll say really fast is that, one of my favorite sayings is conflict, unlike wine, does not age well.
Fair.
And I find that the longer you leave a conflict, the harder it gets to solve, the more parties get involved, you get camps that form, and issues start to multiply. So just jump on it, deal with it, and don't see the other person as the enemy. See them as somebody you're going to have to deal with over the course of time.
Can I make a quick comment on that? I mean, I think what you just did was you shifted the way that I look at conflict myself. And I think you gave me a powerful mindset tool, and many of the listeners as well, in that conflict is not always bad. In fact, most of the time it's not. And you just mentioned it's a natural part of the decision-making process. So now, instead of looking at it and saying, oh my gosh, I know I shouldn't be a conflict avoider, I should go at it. But now I can look at this as a gift to say, well, if this is a part of the decision-making process, this is a part of it. And instead of avoiding it, I can go through it, and we can work through this and obtain our objectives by being creative as well.
That's it. You got it. And honestly, all it takes is doing it once, and doing it effectively once, to see what I'm talking about. Because when you come out the other side of having dealt with a conflict or had a difficult conversation that went well, you're like, it wasn't so bad.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's so true.
So myths, right? I'll make the pivot to myths. So there are a couple of myths. I'll give you three that I see people bring to the negotiation table that are inherently very limiting in terms of their ability to negotiate effectively. So the first one is compromise. So when I will ask people I teach and train, what words come to mind when you hear the word negotiation? Invariably, somebody says compromise. Compromise might be necessary in negotiation. And I say that because in my 30 years of working in this field, what I have learned over the years is that the best negotiators that I've worked with at Harvard and other places, negotiation is really about creativity. It's about problem solving. It's not about what do I have to give up to get where I want to go. It's how do I, first of all, understand what's really important to the other side. What do they value? Do I know what's really critical to them? And then being very clear about what's important to you. And what I find is that when you're focused that way, you're giving thought to, because negotiation is inherently an interdependent process, right? I need the other side to say yes for me to get where I want to go. So if I see the other party as a problem-solving partner in all of this, right? Then let's think about what's the best solution here. How do we create the best deal possible? The phraseology that I like to use when it comes to compromise is make it the last stop on the train instead of the first. When times get difficult, people often will just say, let's split the difference and move on, right? No, that's not what you want to do, because you a lot of times don't even know what the real problem is and whether you really need to split the difference. Maybe there's a way in which, if you think about it and talk about it, and one of the interesting things about negotiation is that we are always working with incomplete information. So the longer you stay at the table, the more information comes out, right? So when somebody, if I stay at the table and we're talking back and forth and somebody says, if we were able to add this to the deal, that would really help us. And I would say, well, wait a minute, I didn't even know you wanted that. Right. So now all of a sudden I have another piece to work with. And I can also be thinking, well, what else can I ask for that might make this deal better? So it's the antithesis of what you were just talking about in your heel digging negotiation, right? It's sharing information. It's saying, let's think more broadly than this and move beyond just price or a single issue to what do we do with this? Like, what else how do we, come up with a solution that meets our needs as best as possible?
So does that come down to asking questions about, hey, what's really important to you? Or what would you suggest?
That's exactly it. In fact, when I ask people when you think of effective negotiators, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And usually they say, oh, really smooth talker or effective communicator in that regard. And it's actually the opposite. It's asking the right questions and listening very carefully. I often find that introverts, despite what they might think, actually make better negotiators because they are very observant. They ask questions, they look, they don't always have to be the center of attention, like us extroverts.
Fair.
And in some ways, they're gathering information. And you don't get information when you talk. You get information when you ask a good question and you really listen to somebody and they share what matters to them.
So stay curious longer, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And throughout the process, and stay at the table for as long as you can, because the more you're there, the more, things reveal themselves. And somebody says, and you could even ask a question. There's a guy at Harvard who's retired named Howard Rafa, a really great guy. He came up with this process that he called post-settlement settlement. It's probably the least sexy name he could think of, but the idea is really great, which is that when two negotiators come up with an agreement, right, what he would say is, bring me your agreement. And if I can make it better for both of you, you'll give me 10% of what I find, right? And people were like, okay. So he did this over a number of years. And in about 90% of the cases, he found value for both sides by asking a very simple question. Is there a way that, now that we've got the core of this agreement, is there a way that we could make this agreement better for both of you? Not one or the other, but both of you, right? And when you ask that question and you already have this sort of agreement that's reasonable, right? All of a sudden people say, well, I guess if we could change the delivery time, or if we could extend our payments in this way, or extend the contract out, that would be beneficial because we have security in terms of knowing we're going to get income, whatever it might be. All of a sudden you change the dynamic. And it's, we often leave value on the table in negotiation. That's the cardinal sin, if you will, of negotiation, is not understanding everything that the parties value. People often will say to me, so, I have this job negotiation coming up. Like, what do I do? How do I negotiate that? And I say, well, the first thing I want you to do is not think about the money. I want you to know what the industry standard is for your salary, but I want you to think about all of the other things that you might ask for as part of this process. So flex time, telecommuting used to be what, was a benefit. I don't know about nowadays, post-COVID, but, do you have daycare? I mean, there's a whole host of things, like what kind of professional development could I engage in over time? So the point is that people value a lot, and yet often in negotiation, we get very limited in our thinking and focused on the most relevant notion or the most relevant idea that we think we ought to be looking at, like salary, right? We know we're going to talk about salary, but what are all the other things you can build in and around an agreement to make it better for you?
Well, and you think about, for real estate investors, that centerpiece is purchase price. Yeah. It's purchase price of the asset. And of course, there's all these other terms, and there's all these other ways to get creative instead of compromising and both parties walking away like, man, that felt horrible and I'm not happy about this, but yeah, I'm signing the agreement and good luck. But you've compromised. And so this myth that you just talked about, instead of compromising, we can reach objectives that are important to our values.
Well, and I'll give you an example from our own life. Last year, we ended up buying a house about a mile from the beach to rent out and then to use. And we were about $10,000, $15,000 apart from the seller. And, this market's been crazy for buyers, right, et cetera.
For sure.
They came back to us and said, is there a way for us to bridge the gap? And I, started to think, my wife and I started thinking creatively, well, what could we do, right?
Did they know who they were dealing with, Josh?
I don't think so, which sometimes is a good thing, right? A lack of knowledge is a good idea. So I said to them, well, what if we were to close in such a way that we wouldn't end up having, a mortgage payment for essentially it became about 6 weeks at the end of the closing and everything like that. So we avoided a mortgage payment, right? And kicked it back a bit. So that had some savings for us. But then we started to say, well, okay, if you really don't want to come off of that, like, what about giving us all the furniture, et cetera? And there were a few other things that we did that got us to a place where the value was about, $12, $13, $14,000. And at that point I said, okay, you know what, that's where we want to be. Right. So, but it was a couple of things that, a lot of times when people get to that point, they say, okay, well, I guess there's nothing else to negotiate. And it's like, no, that's actually when you need to be creative and say, well, what else could we add to the mix so that we don't have to walk away from a house that perhaps we would like, right? Or we see it as a good investment or whatever it might be. Let's start thinking about the deal and the deal design, right? Because there's a lot of ways that you can design deals in negotiation. So start thinking, like, what are the other ways in which you could extend certain things, to help you overcome some of those gaps?
I really like that. Ultimately, it comes down to just being willing to sit on the same side of the table and work on a problem to say, all right, well, what's most important to you? What's most important to me? And for us to look at this as, all right, these are the issues. It's not me versus you. It's us versus these issues. So now let's put the puzzle pieces together.
That's right. And, it's interesting too, because after the fact, after we sold the house, lots of houses have nuances or other kinds of things. And so in as much as we don't think we are going to engage with the seller or the buyer, right? Again, usually you are. There are times when you need them in different ways. And if it's been a very contentious negotiation, you tend not to go out of your way to want to help that person and things along those lines. And so it was very beneficial for us. There were some nuances that were really helpful for them to come over and explain and share. And, they after the fact threw in a couple things that they realized they didn't need. And I think that was because of the way we approached the process.
I like that. Yeah. It's like, it's never helpful to burn a bridge. You just never know what bridges you're going to need in your future and what would at least be helpful. So I love that. So the first myth is compromise, right? The first myth in negotiation is compromise. What are the other two?
So the second one is really that when we think about what does success look like in negotiation, most people say, well, it's reaching agreement. And I would actually say that that's not true. Success in my world in negotiation is meeting my objective as best as possible. So I go into a negotiation and I have a goal. Like we all should have a goal. Sometimes people don't always think about their goal as clearly as they need to. Which is interesting. When I consult with folks, I'll say, what is it you're really trying to achieve? And they will say, well, I'd like to have this or that. I'm like, that's not what I asked you. I said, what is your goal? Like, what do you really need to get out of this negotiation? If you see what you're doing as meeting your objective as best as possible, you could go through a negotiation and get to the end and say, there's a property over there that actually might be better now that I've gone through this laborious process and realize that this doesn't quite fit. Like the terms aren't what we want and they're not budging, et cetera, right? So that's actually, and if you walk away from that negotiation, that in my mind is a success because you understood that you could walk away. We call that, your folks may know this, your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And what it simply means is that when you go into a negotiation, you always want to know, what's my alternative if we can't reach agreement, right? So if you get to the end and you realize your BATNA is better than what's on the table, walk away. And people are afraid sometimes to walk away, but sometimes it's necessary as well to sort of send a signal to the other side that, hey, this isn't going to work for us. And if you want to change things, we're here. One of my colleagues at Harvard, who's since passed, Roger Fisher, a very well-known negotiator, he used to say, and this is kind of going back some ways because he was talking about telephones and actually still having wires. But he used to say, don't be afraid to hang up the phone, but never cut the wire. In other words, give them an opportunity to always call you back. I don't know what that would be in our wireless world today, but you get the point, right? Which is that sometimes you have to walk away, especially when you realize there might actually be a better way to solve this problem or to meet my needs elsewhere. So, and I think also there's a concept from a negotiation point of view called agreement bias. And the closer a deadline gets, the more people are likely to reach agreement, but they're bad agreements. They're general, vague, they leave out details because people are rushing and they don't want to lose out. There's a principle of scarcity that if people think they're going to lose out on something, they agree to that and then realize that after the fact, it wasn't a very good deal or they, left holes, et cetera. So I think, this is all about what are you aiming at in negotiation and how do you know if you got there? So I think if people can shift their mindset from reaching agreement as success to meeting your objective as best as possible as success. It helps a lot, takes the pressure off.
Yeah, and that BATNA, the concept of the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, to me is the ultimate, item that creates leverage, and it gets people ultimately on the same page to say, look, I'm not bluffing. I want to, create, an objective, or I want to reach my objectives, and I understand you have objectives that you want to meet as well. But if for some reason there is no overlap here, then unfortunately we're going to have to move our separate ways. And to me, once that is clearly understood by both parties, then we clearly understand that, hey, we have something that we can work out, or we don't, because we've all put our cards on the table. Do you agree to that?
Yeah. I mean, there's the age old question about, do you share your BATNA or not? And I think sometimes it's okay to. I mean, I usually just say, look, and if it's the truth, which is that I would rather reach agreement here than walking away, I'll say that. But I'll also say, look, I'm not willing to do anything. I've got my limits, and I've got alternatives if I need them. But my goal is to work with you. Like, that's why I'm sitting here. So I think BATNA is a really important concept. And frankly, you can't negotiate effectively if you don't know what your BATNA is. People often say to me, did I get a good deal? I'm like, well, compared to what? Right? There always has to be a comparison. And so I think that's where BATNA comes to play in an important way. And it's also really important that you think about that before the negotiation process. So you think about your own BATNA. What's my walkaway alternative? How good or bad is it? And if it's bad, like if you don't have a very good BATNA, you can take some time and try to work on improving your BATNA. In your world of real estate, that might mean starting some other negotiations to see what else is out there, so that there's less of a need to get this particular property or that particular property. So, I try to do that. And then also on the flip side, you want to also think about, and you have to speculate a little bit, but this is where you've got to put your investigator's hat on and do some research into what's the BATNA of the person I'm dealing with.
Yes.
How good or bad is it as well, right? Because if they don't have a good BATNA, then that also translates into leverage for you.
And as you continue the conversation, you uncover more as the investigator, right? You learn more about their BATNA. You learn more about, hey, is your objective possible? Is their objective possible? And you can have a clear conversation instead of a bargaining, as you mentioned to me. I don't know if that was before our discussion today or before we started recording, bargaining versus negotiating. What we're talking about is negotiating. So these are the myths, but what's myth number 3 on negotiation?
So myth number 3 is that you have to keep emotions out of negotiation. Now, most people, like, it was funny, I was talking to somebody about a month ago, and they said, it's really important that you remain professional in negotiation. And I said, what does that mean? And they said, well, you really can't show your emotions. And I said, look, that's not possible. Like, here's the thing. There are a lot of times people say to me, shit, what should I say in negotiation? Like, how should I sit? How should I do? I'm like, stop. Like, you're not going to be an effective negotiator that way. You can't fake it till you make it. It doesn't work that way. You have to be authentic. You are who you are. Okay. And you have strengths and weaknesses. You build off of those, understand your weaknesses so that when those come up, you're not, they aren't getting used against you, but you have to be you. And you can't try to do all kinds of things that what you think you ought to be doing, or, and there are books out there that say, never say this or always do that. That stuff doesn't work. The only thing that works, and I've seen this with terrific negotiators over the year, people who really know themselves. They understand the biases and the challenges they face, but they're in tune with their self, and they say, okay, so, here's the deal, et cetera. So back to emotions. Look, human beings are logical and emotional creatures. That's who we are. That's how we evolved. That's how we developed. And, if I were to ask you, when you think of emotions in negotiation, what are the emotions that come to mind?
Anger, fear, loss,
right.
Anxiety, I could go on and on.
And they're all negative, right? And yet, right. But there's also an emotion of passion. Like, when we're passionate about something, if one of your real estate investors sees a property that they think has a tremendous potential, they get excited. That's an emotion, right? And that fuels you. It also fuels good negotiators to stay at the table, because they know, hey, at the end of the day, this could be a great deal, and I really want to make this happen. So instead of thinking about how do we keep emotions out, better to think, how do I bring them in a way I don't hesitate to say to somebody, look, I'm frustrated. I thought this process was going to go quite differently, or I'm really confused by what you just said. And we all have triggers too. I mean, for me, when somebody brings sort of a condescending attitude to the table, it's tough. I had somebody a couple months ago say to me, clearly you're not smart enough to understand what I'm telling you. So let me try to break it down for you further.
Whoa.
And I chuckled to myself because I know like that's my trigger. And I took a couple deep breaths and I said, why don't you do that? Right. When instead of reacting and responding, because again, it's so much of negotiation is about you. It's about how you manage yourself. It's like when I say to my kids, she didn't make you angry. You allowed yourself to be angry. They hate me saying that, but it's the truth. Because I don't have the ability to control what you do in negotiation, Tyler. I have the ability to control what I do, period. Full stop, right? So if I can manage myself, if I know that when somebody is really condescending like that, that's going to set me off, and I can temporarily sort of step away and say, manage yourself, that sets you off, and then come back to the table and say, that's, pretty challenging, but go ahead and share it if that's what you need to do. Right.
Instead of going off the rails and just saying something that you regret from there. Right.
Well, and if you do go off the rails and say something, then things have escalated and you've dug yourself a hole, and I got to fill the hole back in before you ever get back to the original conversation. So it's not easy. I mean, I have students who say to me, if we could just strip emotions out of this, it would be a whole lot easier. And I say, I know, but that's not how people work. So, if there's a skill out there that most people ought to invest in, it's learning to be emotionally intelligent, which is managing yourself, managing the other, being self-aware, all of those things. And this is far from pie in the sky. People might be like, oh, that sounds nice. But honestly, it's the truth that when I watch people negotiate and when they make mistakes, it's mostly because their emotions overwhelm them. There's a great quote by a guy named Ambrose Bierce, who is an American humorist, who said, when angry, you'll make the best speech you'll ever regret. And it's a great quote. And I always think about that because I am sitting there thinking to myself, boy, I would love to tell this person what they can do with themselves. Right. But I know that after I say it, about 5 seconds later, I'll be like, damn, why did I say that? I know that that's going to set me back. So it's all about managing the process from your end and your point of view. And that's why, too many people, when it comes to negotiation, they do what I like to call intuit their way through it. And I'm like, listen, do you do that in the rest of your job? No, most people prepare. I mean, preparation is one of the keys to negotiation. And if people aren't preparing, they're preparing to not do well in negotiation. But the other thing that's important about preparation is that a lot of people want to go into negotiation with a plan, right? And plans don't work. The other side doesn't care about your plan, and they're not going to follow it. What you need to do is instead think kind of more contingency planning and say, what's my objective? Like, what's my goal? Where do I want to get to? And then what are the different avenues that are going to enable me to get there? When you have a plan, the landscape is presumably clear, right? Like you understand the landscape you're working in. Negotiation, there's nothing clear about the negotiation landscape. There are all kinds of curveballs and things that get thrown into a process. So you have to expect the unexpected and therefore say, okay, I want to get here. If I go down this road and it's blocked, what do I do? Where do I go then? And then what if that road's blocked? Okay, so that you begin to create a number of avenues to the same end. And when you do that, there's much less of a freak out factor, is the way that I can put it in simple terms, right? Because I don't worry. I'm expecting that an avenue will get blocked. It's when people go in, they think, okay, I'm going to do A, B, and C, and they're going to say yes, and I'm good to go. And then the other side doesn't do that. And that's when people get nervous, they get anxious, and they just give up whatever in order to reach an agreement, because that's what they think they ought to be.
Hey guys, just a quick word from our sponsor, then we'll be right back to the show. This episode of Elevate is brought to you by CF Capital, a national real estate investment firm founded by myself and my business partner, Brian Flaherty. CF Capital's mission is to provide property investment and asset management solutions to help investors like you maximize their returns by investing in high-value multifamily communities. If you are looking for risk-adjusted alternative investments in quality apartment communities, are seeking tax-optimized cash flow with appreciation upside, Without all the hassles of management, you might benefit from learning more about investing alongside our team. You're invited to reach out and learn more about how you can invest with us by visiting cfcapllc.com. We're also currently offering a free ebook called The Bottom Line, 10 Ways to Increase Cash Flow in an Apartment Complex. Whether you're a new or experienced investor, we're confident you'll find massive value in this resource. So go get your free copy today at cfcapllc.com. And now, please enjoy the rest of the show. I think you take a lot of pressure off yourself too when you're exploring that. And instead of creating a monologue and saying, here's my speech and here's what I'm willing to accept and you must accept it or else, or there is no agreement here. It's an exploration to say, well, what are the contingency plans that may actually help you reach your objectives, that may actually help me reach my objectives? And we're kind of putting puzzle pieces together and we're working towards this, outcome together, thinking about that preparation. I think that's an important one to visualize these contingency plans, to be expecting the unexpected, let this thing play out, but be flexible and fluid through that process.
Well, so you put your finger on a key concept that most people don't associate with negotiation, which is agility and flexibility. So my colleague at Harvard, a guy named Mike Wheeler, wrote a book called The Art of Negotiation. And in that book, he talks about that if you want to be a really effective negotiator, you need to learn the skills of improv, because you're constantly getting into information. So he talks about an 80-20 rule. So he says when he does his prep, he thinks he can know about 80% of what he needs to know and how to prepare and things like that. But he knows that there's about 20% of the process and the conversation that's unknown at the beginning. And so he prepares for that. And he says, I know that there's information I don't know right now. I don't know what it is, but I'm mentally preparing myself to adapt to that new information as it comes. And I think that is the way to do this, because as I said, you're always working with incomplete information. There's always things, Tyler, that when we go into a negotiation that I don't, and vice versa, right? And it only comes out during the process, especially if we want to reach a good deal. Those things come to the forefront when it comes to value and stuff like that.
So you talked about preparation being a key. What are some other keys to setting yourself up for success in any negotiation?
Well, there's been a lot obviously made of the internet and the downsides of things. But one of the interesting things about, knowledge is power, information is power. And so, I think it's really important that people do a lot of research and try to understand what they can, not only about their own situation, et cetera, but also what the other negotiator needs. Again, this is an interdependent process. And so if you say to the other negotiator, it's kind of thinking a little bit about what might be important to you in all of this, blah, blah, blah. There's no better way to disarm somebody than to say, I thought about what might be important to you. Because most people aren't thinking that at all. They're thinking, this is what I need in negotiation, and I don't really care what the other person needs. If somebody says to you, and I've had this happen quite a bit, where people say to me, well, that's your problem. When you figure it out, let me know. I'm like, you have no idea how to negotiate. If you think this is my problem, because I'm the one who gets to say yes or no to whether you get what you want. So why would you say that? Like, it doesn't make sense, right? So I think but you have to really work at a problem, and when it comes to that preparation, you've got to think, how do I get this information? And it might be that I've got a colleague who's worked in Tampa, and I'm trying to buy a property there. Let me call this guy and talk to them, or girl, or whatever, and mine them for information and try to figure out. You got to be really creative about how you gather that information, as part of the process. So I think that's another one. I mentioned the agility, flexibility piece of this. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of dynamics and dimensions to negotiation that are important. We're increasingly negotiating using virtual tools like this. And it's also important to know what's the best medium for you and why. A lot of times people say to me, well, face-to-face is always the best way to negotiate. I'm like, no, it's not. And they're like, what do you mean, no, it's not? They say, well, there are a lot of people that find the negotiation process anxiety producing, right? LinkedIn did a study of approximately 8,500 people, kind of an informal thing. And they asked a simple question: how comfortable are you negotiating? 37% of men said me, 26% of women said me. Flip the numbers around. That's a lot of people who are not comfortable negotiating. And one of the biggest reasons they're not comfortable negotiating is because if I were to say something and we're sitting across from each other, Tyler, and you lost your marbles and started yelling at me, there are a lot of people who would say, oh God, I don't know what to do right now. So I'm just going to give them what they want so I can leave and get rid of the anxiety. Mm-hmm. Right? Well, no, that's not what you want to do, right? Obviously. So instead, for example, those folks are actually far better off negotiating via email. Now, you have to know the do's and don'ts of email. You have to know that the rule with email is if it can be misinterpreted, it will be, right? Mm-hmm. But you have to ask questions. So if somebody writes you something in an email, instead of reacting and responding to something in a way that might be, less than optimal and making all kinds of assumptions, ask them, well, so you mentioned this. There's a bunch of ways I can interpret that. Can you explain to me what you meant? Right? And when you use low, rich mediums like email, low, rich medium means that it's devoid of some context and things like that. You have to be more attuned to that. And you have to be more attuned to the notion that assumptions and perceptions can get in the way and wreak havoc on a process. But what I find is for people who do find negotiation a little bit anxiety producing, negotiating via email gives them time to reflect on an offer, right? They don't have to make a decision in the moment, which is where a lot of people make their mistakes. If they get angry or upset or frustrated from an emotional point of view, they can manage that. They could step away, go get a coffee, and then write the email, right? Things like that. So there's actually a lot of benefits to negotiating asynchronously that a lot of people don't really think about. I did a TEDx talk a few years back called The Wired Negotiator. And the whole point was to say, pick your medium, and think about the best way in which you can use a certain medium to your advantage and that that's comfortable for you. Now, again, you have to be careful because a lot of people use email and they'll be flaming and doing all kinds and the rule is if you're not going to say it in person, don't say it, via email. But there's a lot of rules and do's and don'ts out there that I think are good for guidance when it comes to picking the right vehicle for you to negotiate.
Yeah. One of the things that I've thought about myself is even when I'm in say I'm in person or say we're on the phone or maybe we're on a Zoom doing a negotiation, there are times where, we're presented an offer or there is an ultimatum that's made. And, the initial thought process is, well, I have to respond to it now. It's like either yes or no, or, there is a deal or we don't have a deal, we're walking away. It's win or lose at all costs. What I've kind of trained myself on, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that's really interesting. Let me consider that and let's come back together when we've had some time to kind of evaluate. And that's kind of my foundational thought. Instead of saying, hey, this is going to be so anxiety producing because, it's so high stakes, we can take some time and be measured in that approach.
Completely agree with you. I almost never, unless I absolutely have to, and I can't remember the last time I absolutely had to answer in the moment, I almost never say yes in the moment. I always say, can I just sleep on this for a night and get back to you tomorrow? Because what invariably happens is I realized there was an implication to saying yes that I hadn't thought of in the moment. Right now, it's a clearer picture. I have a much better sense. I can think it through a little bit differently. And so without question. And I also think, by the way, we negotiate with ourselves a lot. When people are silent or quiet, people start to get nervous. You have to realize that silence is okay. I mean, just as a quick story, one of my friends, academic, had been given sent a book offer, up front kind of advance. And it got sent to him on Friday before Memorial Day weekend. And he was going away with his family. So he didn't respond. He just decided, okay, I'll get back, I'll deal with it when I get back and whatever. And when he got home, he didn't check his email over the weekend. When he got home Monday night, there was another offer from the publishing company for an additional $5,000 on top of what they offered him. And he said to me, he's like, I was fine with the first offer, but they obviously got nervous because they didn't hear back from them. So something was wrong. Let's up our offer, yada, yada, yada. And, so this is where, people read into negotiations. We do this all the time. We start assuming things. We start having conversations in our heads. My colleague who I've worked with for 30 years, a guy named William Ury, who was one of the authors of Getting to Yes, the famous negotiation book, he wrote another book a couple of years ago called Getting to Yes with Yourself.
Mm.
And it's a great book because he says, the hardest negotiator that you often have to deal with is the one looking back at you in the mirror. Because we start to make up all kinds of things when we're not clear about what we're supposed to be doing, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, that's one where, and that goes back to preparation, by the way. Like, we start to negotiate with ourselves when we have not done our homework and we think, I better give this up because I don't want to lose this deal, or et cetera. Right. So,
yeah, it seems like we come back to that thought of negotiation ultimately comes down to your own mindset, your own psyche, your perspective. So if you could expand upon that, I mean, how would you illuminate the listeners and help them understand further how their own mindset, really sort of leads to their success or failure when it comes to negotiation?
Well, I mean, there's an old adage, right, which is that if everything looks like a nail, you use a hammer. And so if you go into a negotiation with a certain mindset, let's imagine you go in with a win-lose mindset and say, I'm going to win this negotiation. That's the solution you're looking for. You're not open to other possibilities that maybe Tyler's interests are not as, opposite as I thought from mine. So I think that when you go in and you have a mindset that's curious, that's engaged, that's wanting to sort of think, where's the creative deal that could be had here? How can we figure out how to understand what each really values? And by that, I don't just mean money. As we've talked about before, there's lots of things that people value in a given realm. I mean, I love doing what I do. That has value to me. When people offer me a particular opportunity, like coming on your show, I get great value out of talking about this because I think it helps people, right? So I think that if you can come into a negotiation curious, problem solving, seeing the other, as you mentioned, as a partner, and that the problem is the issue on the table, not them, right? All of those things help you to keep working a problem. And I think that's the other thing, is that I find that people will say, well, I tried to negotiate and it didn't work. I'm like, well, what happened? Well, I made an offer and they said it was too low. So they made an offer and I said, that's too high. And that was it. I said, you didn't negotiate. You don't even know what they want in this negotiation, really. And there are a lot of companies that I work with, and process stuff, they don't even think about it. Like, one company that I was working with said, when I asked them about process, they said, well, we give them our standard contract, we send it to them, and they mark it up and they send it back to us. And then we go back and forth. They said, at what point do you meet? And they're like, we don't really meet. We might meet to sign off on it, but we don't really meet. I said, well, that's not a good way to negotiate. From a process point of view, you're not really ever able to ask questions and try to understand, does this standard contract that's boilerplate meet their interests or not? Are there other things that could be woven in here? So I really think that it's being curious, it's asking questions, it's recognizing that there's information out there that you need to understand to kind of come up with the best way forward. And being patient. I'm not quite sure what it is, but I often talk to people, they're like, we got to wrap this up. I'm like, why? Where are you going? What is there a deadline? If there is, okay, I get it. And what is it? But if there isn't, let's just keep working the problem. Guys, I think it will be to both of our benefits if we can create not just the most obvious deal, but the best one.
Let's talk about that real quick, because if there is a deadline, let's say an investor is bumping up on the due diligence deadline, their time frame is, they got 3-4 days left, and you're making progress towards an agreement, and your objectives are getting closer for both parties, and you seem like you're making some progress, but you're not there yet, and you feel like you might need some more time. And instead of saying, hey, let's wrap this up in 3-4 days, let's give ourselves an extra 2 weeks. Is it optimal to say, hey, let's both be realistic here and give ourselves an extra 2 weeks? I mean, in a perfect scenario, it seems like it would, but what would your comments be on that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would, anytime I'm negotiating and there's a deadline looming, I'll get to a point where I'll say, tell me about this deadline. Why does it exist? What happened? Do we turn into a pumpkin when we hit it? What happens? And usually it's like, well, we need to move on. I'm like, well, is it hard and fast? Or, if we're making some good progress and we see promise here, can you bump it back a week? What happens if you can't? Usually people have flexibility. A lot of times deadlines are just to kind of get a decision made and for the other side to try to pressure you to, give up more than you would like to. So I would just probe a bit and sort of say, well, is there a way that you can go back to your boss and, get another week so that we can do this in a way that feels good to both of us, or something along those lines?
It feels like this approach that you speak of, I mean, overall, sort of everything that we've talked about today, I think it does come down to mindset. It does come down to that curious mindset, the creative problem solving, resourcefulness mindset, seeing the other as a partner rather than an adversary. And ultimately what you shared with me as well, and I don't recall if it was during our recording here or prior to, but it ultimately preserves your reputation. And I know that in the real estate business, it's a small world, right? It's almost, across the country, and even in certain regions, we all run into people who know each other or know of each other. And ultimately your reputation is everything. Could you speak a little bit about the importance of preserving reputation in a negotiation?
I think it's fundamental. Negotiation, you always have to balance your short-term needs, that specific deal with the longer-term relationship. And I will tell you that in general, every time that I've done my best, which most of the time I try to preserve the relationship and build the relationship, it comes around in a way that I never expected. And I've also heard of a lot of stories where where people did sacrifice their reputation, and ultimately people found out about it or whatever it was, and they didn't have a lot more deals to do. So I think it's one of those things that you have to be super conscious of. I mean, my grandmother always used to say to me, the only thing you have in life is your name and your reputation. And I agree with you. We live in a world where we're more connected than ever, and if you don't think someone's going to Google, like I'm dealing with Tyler, if you don't think they're going to Google you and see what people have to say about you as a negotiator or a business person or whatever, you're crazy, because they will. Right. So I think it's really important that you negotiate in a manner where you can always kind of come out and feel like, okay, like that was fine. Like I didn't do anything that would hamper me in the future. And I think a lot of people are moving away from that. Some people are slow to do it. I think a lot of people in particular who think that they're going to just engage in one-off negotiations, and so the relationship doesn't matter and their reputation doesn't matter. I think they're coming to understand slowly but surely that that's just kind of not how it works anymore. And I mean, there's still some people who are like that, and they say, I don't care, I'll take my chances. And you may get burned once or twice, but I would rather that happen to me than to do something where I end up, tarnishing my reputation and being worried that someone's going to Google me and say, I'm not going to negotiate with this Josh Weiss guy. He seems, sketchy.
Josh, this is so valuable. This is one of my favorite conversations we've had on the podcast, and one that I know is extremely valuable for our listeners and for anybody who is looking to build and design a life through real estate, because ultimately those are the objectives. It's not about the deal. It's not about the cash flow, the return on investment, but it's about what happens on the back end of that. And so truly understanding that, knowing thyself a bit more, understanding our own emotions that are at play, understanding that our counterparts are not adversaries, and that we can look at this as a problem that we can solve together. I mean, what a valuable conversation, Josh. I just want to thank you so much. I'm looking forward to continuing our relationship together and continuing to learn together as a result. But I want to transition into the rapid fire section of the podcast before we wrap today. It's called the Rare Air Questionnaire. This is about being uncommon. I think the common approach to negotiation is bargaining. It's high-low. It's lazy. You walk away feeling like crap. But what we're talking about is being rare, being uncommon. So with that said, I've got a few questions for you. If you had to point to 2 or 3 of the most impactful books that you've read over the past few years, what would those be and why?
So, I mean, I would definitely say Getting to Yes was a seminal work in the field, and I think a critical one for anybody to read who wants to really understand this. There's also another book called Negotiating the Impossible by a guy named Deepak Malhotra at Harvard Business School that I really like. It's it's examples and scenarios that are out, that he looks at of really difficult negotiations and how they were solved. So those are some. And then I honestly, I love anything by Malcolm Gladwell, because I think Malcolm Gladwell connects the dots in a way that I think really effective negotiators look and they look for ways of connecting the disconnected or the unconnected. And I think I love the way he thinks. And I think that if you can bring that way of thinking to negotiation, of looking for where's the angle here? Where's the way of connecting X, Y, and Z in this particular situation? It's incredibly valuable. So
I tell you what, I got chills. And the reason why is because I feel the exact same way about Malcolm Gladwell. I love the way that he thinks. I love the way that he brings complex ideas and makes sense of them and helps sort of correlate and bring patterns into a meaningful dialogue so that we can make sense of important ideas, whether it's a tipping point, blink. I mean, you name it, you go on and on. But it's so interesting that you bring it up that way, because when you think about a complex negotiation, it is about gathering complex data and making sense of patterns and being able to understand as well what our counterparts' objectives are so that we can sort of put this complex puzzle piece together and draw correlations and connection. That's really insightful.
It just fits. I mean, it's a way of training your brain. I do a lot of lateral thinking puzzles and with my kids, and you have to train your mind to think differently. That for me, that's where really effective negotiators go. They don't think, well, we can split the difference, or you do this, I do that. It's like, no. You got to think really differently about this problem. And when you start doing that, you say, oh, wait a minute, what if we were to do it this way? And then all of a sudden the other side says, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. If we did that, we'd have to add this to the mix, but that's possible, right? And so now you're off on a Malcolm Gladwell tangent.
Well, you put yourself in the world of possibilities, which is where everything happens. Josh, what's the biggest way that you elevate your life on a daily basis? Is it training your brain like we just talked about, or is there something else that you would point to?
So it's training. I would say it's training my brain. I also really have gotten into walking. I just find that walking clears everything out. Some of my best ideas come from that, unlike like a lot of people in history who have actually sort of done that. I got involved in a project many years ago in the Middle East where we were working on and designing the development of a long distance walking route across the Middle East region. And it gave me an appreciation for walking and thinking, and in a way that I've found incredibly helpful. So I love to walk. I've got 2 dogs and we walk a couple of times a day, and I walk as much for me as for them.
Yeah. And I felt the same way. I mean, I've got a dog myself, a German Shepherd. And yesterday it was actually, I mean, like I said, we were in this intense negotiation, and it was like, I gotta get out. I gotta get some fresh air. I gotta breathe. I gotta take the AirPods out, like no listening. I just want to breathe and be here and think. And it's powerful, man. I totally
agree. By the way, on that, I also am now trying to do more and more of my negotiations while I'm walking. So that you get out of the boardroom where you're sitting face to face with somebody in an adversarial way, and just say, hey, you want to just go for a walk and talk about this?
I love it.
Because what you do is you change the dimension of things. Now you're walking toward the problem. You're walking side by side, right? And you're walking toward the problem, and you're thinking together. And there's a lot of research on walking that says that, more oxygen, more problem solving, more creative thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I think for a lot of people who find negotiation anxiety producing, it also changes the dimension there. It's like, okay, we're just going for a walk and let's see what happens.
Yeah. And there's this subconscious communication of, hey, we're side by side, and it's not me versus you. It's us moving forward. I mean, there's probably a lot to be said about that. There
is. Yeah. There's some interesting research out there. Yeah.
What's the biggest way that you elevate others around you, Josh?
I mean, I guess in some ways it's a little bit of this, which is just having conversations about this kind of stuff. I mean, and in particular, when people are faced with very difficult conflicts, talking to them and giving them a sense that this isn't that abnormal. Like this isn't such an obscure thing. Like this happens to everybody, but also helping them to kind of think and reflect and to deal with these things in a way that can be productive, like trying to help people to realize that they can actually handle this stuff effectively if they give some thought to it and don't just react. Human beings are reaction machines. And when we learn to pull back a little and think it through, I think that's probably, the imparting of the knowledge and skills that I've been lucky to learn over the course of my life. And seeing people coming out the other end and saying, I get it. Like this makes so much sense.
Yeah. Josh, man, this is very illuminating, very insightful, educational, and I think extremely valuable for the listener. So I just want to thank you. I want to acknowledge you for not only committing your life's work to such an important paradigm of negotiation, but giving that to others. I think constructing our reality in a more constructive way, such as the way that you approach negotiation, is so valuable. We need it. We're not all against each other. We're all in this together. And so I just want to acknowledge you. I want to thank you, and want to show you my appreciation for being here. Tell the listeners if you have any parting thoughts or words of wisdom for Elevate Nation today.
You can do this. It requires, some thinking, some planning, et cetera, but don't listen to what the world is telling you ought to do. Realize that you've got to be you, but take the time to learn the skills, the knowledge, the strategy, the analysis, and you won't regret it. I can tell you that much. I've got students who go through my master's degree program and they come out and they say, I don't know how my life would ever be the same after this experience. And I think that a lot of people can get that too if they really take the time to learn these skills and knowledge. And anybody can. We have different levels we can achieve, but anybody can get better. And I firmly believe that.
I love that. We can move forward with the confidence that we can do this. Thank you for that reminder. Josh Weiss, everybody. Josh, again, thank you so much for being on the show. Where can the listeners learn more about you and stay connected?
So I do have a website. So it's www.joshuaandweiss.com. And all my books, and I've written some children's books as well, as a few other books on negotiation, and podcasts and other resources for folks. It's all there, and you can get in touch with me there as well if you'd like.
Well, look forward to that. I will put links, or our team will put links in the show notes. That's where the listeners can connect with you, Josh. But until next time, I really look forward to continuing our discussion together. But thank you again for being on the podcast.
No, thank you, Tyler. It was great. Enjoyed it.
What an amazing conversation with Josh Weiss. I don't know about you, but I just learned so much about negotiation. I'm in the middle of this crazy high-low bargaining, sort of situation. And it's like, man, let's get back to the drawing board. Let's revise. Let's sit on the same side of the table. Let's take a deep breath. It's not me versus you. It's us together looking to accomplish objectives. I think we get caught up in that. And sometimes the real estate industry and, space can just be so fast paced, and we get away from some of these learnings. There's just so much here. And when you think about mindset being fundamental, I just, I'm excited and happy that we understand that we're investing in our mindset by being a part of Elevate Nation together. We're investing in our own perspective. We're investing in our own psyche. We're understanding more about how others' investment, other psyches or mindsets or perspectives interface with ours in these type of agreements. And ultimately what we're talking about is designing a life through real estate. So I just want to thank you so much for listening. I want to encourage you to re-listen to the show. We learn twice as much when we listen more than once. We're going to learn more things and recognize more things that we didn't recognize at the first glance. So I look forward to re-listening myself. I want to encourage you to share this with a friend and have a discussion with someone else about, hey, what did you learn in your last negotiation as a result of learning from this podcast today? What could you have done better? What can you bring to your next negotiation? What skills, what preparation can you engage in? What contingency planning, what improv can you train so that you can step into a greater sense of creating and achieving those objectives as a result of interfacing with others in this space? I just want to encourage you to really dive in and ultimately commit to taking massive action. What is your commitment to take massive action? What are the top 1, 2, or 3 distinctions that you want to make sure that you apply and that those become a part of your reality as a result of listening to this podcast? So I just want to thank you so much for listening, Elevate Nation. It's been my pleasure. Until next time, Elevate Nation, we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Elevate. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, subscribe, and pay it forward by sharing with a friend. Most importantly, take this opportunity to elevate your results by taking immediate action on what you learned. For more, visit elevatepod.com.